And we'll move on now to our second finalist and third presentation of the day. And we've already been hearing from him, so great engagement here. So our last speaker is Dr. Steve Lipshultz. If we could have that slide come up. He's going to talk about late health outcomes after dexrazoxane treatment, a report from the Children's Oncology Group. You can correct me on the pronunciation there.
Great.
We bring up the slide, please.
Dexrazoxane.
Yeah.
Dr. Lipshultz, you are able to share your screen, but if you prefer, I can share them for you.
Let me see if I know how to do this. I'm not sure I know how to do it. So maybe if you want to bring it up in the interest of time. Okay, great. Thanks. Could we go to full screen, please? Thank you. So next slide, please. So here in the learning objectives, want to really try to go over the nature of cardiotoxicity in childhood cancer survivors, and to understand how we have worked to prevent cardiotoxicity. And next slide, please. So anthracycline-induced cardiotoxicity, mechanisms of action, and in childhood cancer patients, anthracyclines, which include adriamycin, are one of the most commonly used agents historically, and currently their cardiotoxicity is cumulative. It's mostly irreversible. It's dependent on individual sensitivity. It's unpredictable, and it's underestimated. Let's see if we can get the cartoon to work. So these anthracyclines bind to iron in the cardiomyocytes, result in free radical release, and kill cardiomyocytes, resulting in less heart muscle. Next slide, please. And when we looked at anthracyclines for the treatment of childhood cancer, the red shows that more than half of kids 0 to 14 years of age are treated with them for a lot of leukemias, lymphomas, sarcomas, and the like. And with more than 27 years of follow-up, childhood cancer survivors have a 5-fold higher risk of death from cardiovascular disease than the general population. And cardiovascular disease is the leading non-cancer cause of mortality in these survivors. And other risk factors also contribute. Next slide, please. When we look at it, anthracycline-induced cardiotoxicity is cumulative. Work has shown that increased cardiac biopsy grades associated with higher doxorubicin doses, adriamycin, and we've shown dead and dying heart muscle with troponin, with anthracycline even starts with the first dose, and the risk of heart failure before 40 increases with the cumulative dose. So for many children treated with 350 to 450 milligram per meter squared of let's say doxorubicin, adriamycin, at 17 years of follow-up, about 15% will have heart failure. That's pretty significant. Next slide, please. And it's not just heart failure. From a large group, French-British childhood cancer survivor cohort with over 86,000 patient years of follow-up in the general population in France and Great Britain compared to population appropriate age controls. You can see here that in A on the left, all cardiovascular disease, and B on the right, for these young survivors, even 20, 25 years out, that were about 4 years of age when they were diagnosed, so they're still about 25, 30 years old. The further they get away from exposure to this agent, it's not that they're getting healthier, their mortality is going up significantly compared to population. So for both morbidity and mortality, this is very important. Next slide, please. One of the things that we did and published is looking at a whole consortium that we had funded by the National Cancer Institute, that the Dana-Farber Childhood Cancer Institute ALL Consortium of high-risk children with acute lymphoblastic leukemia that were diagnosed at 4.8 years of age. When they were diagnosed at 0.0, they got anthracycline, doxorubicin, adriamycin. At the end of this, they had asymptomatic dilated cardiomyopathy. Over time, it normalized. There were over a dozen papers published saying it's reversible, but that early hit was really important. This early doxorubicin hit resulted in late cardiotoxicity. And as they went through puberty, as they grew, they lost so much muscle early on that their hearts were too small for their body. They developed a restrictive cardiomyopathy by 14 years. By 20 years and 30 years, large epidemiologic studies show consistently increased morbidity and mortality related to cardiovascular toxicity. Next slide, please. We found that that when we looked 8 years after getting anthracycline for childhood cancer, girls were much more susceptible than boys, and our multivariable analyses increased cumulative doses of anthracycline were equally a problem, resulting in depressed heart function years later. We found, though, that for growing children, younger age at diagnosis or increased years since treatment, in our multivariable analyses, there was less muscle in their hearts. It increased the stress on the walls of the heart, and it drove it down as well. Next slide, please. What we found is that when we looked at the same cohort that I just showed you, 14 years, now with up to 40 years of follow-up, so these kids were diagnosed at about 5 and now they're about 45, call it Grinch syndrome. We made it up because the Grinch had a heart too small for a body. His got normal when he got aware of how he was acting. These kids have hearts that are too small for their body, and we see with 40 years of follow-up, the amount of mass in their heart relative to the size of their body is well below normal, and that's a problem. Next slide, please. That's what leads to that restrictive cardiomyopathy pattern. So we studied, my colleagues and I, in the laboratory in our rodent models and elsewhere, a great number of agents that made sense. Dextrazoxane is one that we focused on. It partially acts by binding iron. The dextrazoxane binds iron before anthracyclines enter the cardiomyocytes. The binding to iron prevents the formation of iron anthracycline complexes and thereby prevents free radical release and cardiac damage. You can click so we can see the cartoon go. Here's the dextrazoxane. It binds to the iron. Here's the anthracycline. It can't bind, and the result is no free radical release and reduced cardiomyocyte apoptosis. Next slide, please. Some of our work in rats showed that when we gave adriamycin doxorubicin 7 courses, similar to what a child would get, we started to see in the photomicrographs of myocardium vacuolizations and myofibrillar loss with dextrazoxane. They looked about the same, maybe a little bit better. But most of our kids get 12 courses every 3 weeks apart. And the kids that, the rats here that didn't get the dextrazoxane cardioprotection before every dose of anthracycline, in this case doxorubicin, had terrible looking hearts. And the ones that got the dextrazoxane before every dose had relatively normal hearts. So based on that, next slide, please. We got NCI funding and did a multi-center, double-blinded randomized controlled trial. Our secondary endpoint was damage during therapy. Our real endpoint was 5 years later as survivors. Our data safety monitoring board forced us to unblind and report in New England Journal the results between the 2 groups of kids that had high-risk acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the most common type of childhood cancer from about 2 to 18. And those that got the doxorubicin alone had 50% dead and dying heart muscle. Those that got the dextrazoxane before every dose of doxorubicin only had 20% of the patients had dead and dying heart muscle. And when we looked at it sequentially, increasing cumulative doses, increasing dead and dying heart muscle in the group that didn't get cardioprotection. And that was protected even with highest doses later. Next slide, please. We also, in this first study, we found that for those of you that aren't familiar with the term ventricular remodeling, this is an adult myocardial apical infarct. There's an infarct here. Over time, it thins and dilates, gets worse, has worse outcome. Here, our marker of pathologic ventricular remodeling was here. And what we saw now, these are the same patients I just showed you during therapy before this. So this is a paper we had in Lancet that oncology that we, is the 5-year follow-up. Those that got the dextrazoxane before every dose didn't have pathologic remodeling of their heart. Those that did not get the dextrazoxane had progressive pathologic remodeling of their heart. Next slide, please. We did another very large second NCI supported study that we published in Journal of Clinical Oncology. This was over 600 childhood cancer newly diagnosed patients randomized to get dextrazoxane or not before every dose of anthracycline. Superimposable, exact same thing. That years later, the function of the heart fractional shortening was normal in those that got it, was depressed in those that didn't, and it was statistically significant. The amount of muscle in the heart is measured here by wall thickness adjusted for body surface area. Normal with dextrazoxane, significantly reduced there. Pathologic remodeling, same thing, no remodeling in those that got it. Significant pathologic remodeling in those that didn't. Third slide study. Please, next slide, please. Thanks. So, before we started any of these, we went to FDA and they told us we needed to do about 4 prospective studies before regulators would consider this. Our third study was looking at dextrazoxane cardioprotection for additive cardiotoxicity. So these were in some of our osteosarcoma patients that had HER2 receptor positivity and were being treated concurrently with Herceptin and doxorubicin, both cardiotoxic. Those that, when we look here at function of the heart, left ventricular fractional shortening with the dextrazoxane, even with the additive cardiotoxicity, it was protected normal heart function. When we looked here at the stress on the walls of the heart, NT-proBNP, same thing. Both groups were under the cardiomyopathy threshold and not even at the heart failure level. So this was a beneficial effect. Next slide, please. The fourth study that they asked us to do was to see if dextrazoxane was cardioprotective when the anthracycline was given with unimaginably high doses that were felt to be unethical without cardioprotection. So these childhood and adolescent patients with osteosarcoma, we went from where we normally cap it at about 450 milligram per meter squared to 600 milligrams per meter squared. And with dextrazoxane, both groups were not significantly different from normal. Next slide, please. Thank you. And what we found here is in those, in all of these patients, when we looked years later, those dextrazoxane helped for the boys. Their hearts had normal dimensions as they got older, but for the girls, they were still affected more than the boys and lost still muscle cells. It wasn't a perfect protection, but much, much better than if they got nothing. So they had smaller dimensions of the hearts, the girls did, compared to normal, and as a result, higher stress on their left ventricles, which, considering they have decades of active, productive life, is not a good thing. Next slide, please. And when we looked at this, we found that the dextrazoxane, when we gave it, protected a mitochondriopathy. So normally with this, with these chemotherapeutic agents, there's accelerated mitochondrial aging. When we gave the dextrazoxane before each dose, we found the mitochondria were protected very significantly. Next slide, please. So this prompted us to say, well, this is team science. We care about lifetime cardio protection. It was great. We could show that during therapy, we had less dead and dying heart muscle. Great. We reported that in New England Journal. Great. We could show that 5 years later, when we brought everybody in, we had in Lancet that their hearts were significantly better. But these 4-year-olds, when they're diagnosed, look forward to decades of active, productive life. So if we're going to give them this, the two things we were interested in, did this really result in long-term protection? And two, did it have any negative effects? In other words, if it's protecting the heart cells from not getting damaged by chemotherapy, over the long haul, does this also protect the malignancy from being effectively treated? So my colleague Eric Chow in Seattle, Washington, and I were co-principal investigators. We wrote a large NCI grant that got funded, and we searched around the world, 172 sites. We brought back ultimately 200 patients from as far away as Perth, Australia, Hawaii, United States, Puerto Rico, Canada, and the like. And these were the patients that had been randomized to receive it on all the studies that I just went over with you. So now fast forward, this is 18, 20 years later. Now these kids are now 28 years old on average. Next slide, please. And what we found in this study that Wire asked me to present here is that dextrazoxane was safe and effective for protecting the hearts of pediatric cancer patients from the toxicity of chemotherapeutic drugs even 18 years later. So the dextrazoxane in this paper that we had in Cancer, it wasn't associated with relapse of the initial cancer. It wasn't associated with an increased risk of second cancers. It was not associated with all-cause mortality. And on the cardiac end, it was not associated with cardiovascular mortality. In fact, among the randomized patients treated with dextrazoxane, serious cardiovascular outcomes, such as cardiomyopathy, ischemic heart disease, and stroke, occurred in only 5.6% of patients versus 17.6% of patients who weren't treated with it in this randomized group of patients. And this was statistically significant. Next slide, please. We also found that after 18 years of follow-up, the dextrazoxane treated group was associated with better heart function and less heart stress. The dextrazoxane cardioprotection was more pronounced in females and those who received higher anthracycline cumulative doses, and lower heart function, again, 18 years later after getting this, was less common in those that got dextrazoxane. Next slide, please. So this resulted in regulatory bodies approving the use of this. And, it's sort of, I've never thought of it in these terms, but there have been at least 15 articles in business investment magazines. This was one that was a press release from this past August. Dextrazoxane market is booming worldwide by global demand analysis, and they recommend, if you're an investor, buying it between now and 2028. I own nothing in it. I'm not conflicted, but it was just interesting as an investigator caring for these kids for decades now. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, cardiotoxicity associated with cancer therapeutics can be pervasive, persistent, progressive, but missed clinically. Cardiovascular health burden is increasing as this expanding population ages. Genetic, environmental, temporal factors cause this toxicity. Persistent mitochondrial damage may relate to the lifespan cardiotoxicity. As I was showing here, the dextrazoxane is cardioprotective. It allows safe dose escalation. the use of additive cardiotoxic therapy, the use of anthracycline therapy for patients with pre-existing cardiomyopathies. And we, along with regulatory bodies, encourage its use in this setting. And as Allison, our dean, said earlier today, this is all team science. So in matters of the heart here, we're all in this together with cardiologists, oncologists, and a variety of others focusing on this issue, as shown in the graphic. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Three terrific talks from about three terrific clinical research trials. So